How you doing, everybody? Welcome back to Before I Forget. This is my video channel inspired by my Instagram channel, 1985 Road Dog. If you haven't checked out the Instagram, check it out. It's got a lot of my photos from my time in music, working in the business, and also as a fan in the early days as a teen. I was just listening to some music. I was listening to a playlist, the best of 1979. Cars, Clash, Police, Kiss was on that playlist with Dynasty. But what it made me think of was the people that were in that age bracket or in those years, the 70s, the 60s, the 70s, into the early 80s. It's people form bands, musicians form bands because they wanted to play music and they wanted to express themselves. And, it got to the point in the 80s where, guys were forming bands. Everybody just wanted to be huge from the get-go. They wanted to form a band, put out a record, and be playing stadiums like immediately. That was the mentality going into the end of the 80s. Bands weren't in it for the right reasons, but what are the right reasons? Rock and roll, sex, drugs, rock and roll. I mean, that was really the mantra: sex, drugs, rock and roll, all through the 70s and 80s. But you look at a band like The Clash, so influential. One of my favorite artists of all time are The Clash, especially Joe Strummer and all his solo stuff with the Mescaleros. But I mean, there's a guy that they were huge, The Clash. More culturally, they had a big impact. They weren't mega stars in the sense of having, they weren't, Bon Jovi or something. The Clash were, let's say a political band, but they had something to say. They part of the punk movement. But by 82, The Clash are opening for The Who in baseball stadiums, you know what I mean? And then they broke up shortly after that. But The Clash today, and Joe Strummer specifically, so influential across the board. But the guy never set out to do what he was doing to play football stadiums and baseball stadiums. That's not why he started it, Before The Clash, he was in a band called the 101ers, like a pub rock band, doing 50s and 60s R&B covers. But a lot of those people back then, a lot of those musicians, a lot of those bands, a lot of those artists didn't start out to my intention is to play a stadium. But by the end of the 80s, it was everyone's intention to play a stadium immediately. I mean, no one was it was about that more than anything else. The songs and the music were just a byproduct of the party. It wasn't, there was no significance in a lot of the music. I mean, yes, out of all those bands from the 80s, we're talking hard rock, metal bands, whatever you want to call it, who really had, impact, who changed music, who stylistically and socially and everything else, who changed the game. And it was Guns N' Roses, really. Motley Crue were big and Rat were big and all these bands were big, but Guns N' Roses changed the game. Guns N' Roses' Appetite for Destruction was, Fleetwood Mac Rumors level, Frampton Comes Alive level. It was, it was huge. So those guys, as a band, didn't start out with the intention of, we want to play stadiums either. Their intention was, we want to be rock and roll guys and live the life and write good songs and have a killer band. It was not about playing stadiums. But there was so many of the attitude of a lot of bands was you got a record deal and you better be opening for somebody in an arena or headlining an arena within the first album or two. It was really a lot of pressure to compete with, again, you're competing with Bon Jovi level Slippery When Wet success, which was huge, So it was something that struck me today. How the earliest bands, Aerosmith, well, I got to say the exception to that rule is probably Kiss, because Kiss started from day one. They wanted to be huge and play Madison Square Garden. So that's kind of like that drive, that real, the hunger to do that and to be that, which was great because loved early Kiss. But for the most part, it was about the music. It was about writing songs and rocking hard and doing drugs and getting girls and being a rock band. That's what it was. The intention was never to be mega huge. And things got out of whack in the 80s with the sales of, Fleetwood Mac Rumors was a big one that sold a lot of copies. It was like one of the first to sell 20 million or something. So then the bar had been set. So then you've got, you come into the 80s and you've got, of course, Michael Jackson and Thriller. But, selling 20 million albums was expected, if you had a big push behind you from a major record label. Bon Jovi level, Guns N' Roses level, 20 million records. It was out of whack. And then the grunge thing kicked in. And then Nirvana sold millions of records. But again, there's a band their intention wasn't to play stadiums. They got really, really big, like Freaky. And it kind of freaked them out, I think, Cobain. So, fame is like, it's a double-edged sword, but there's bands that formed and wanted to be a band in order to be mega huge and celebrity huge, Bon Jovi huge. And those bands, I don't know, musically there's nothing there for the most part. Who those bands are, you have to figure it out on your own or make your own assumptions, but they're out there. And it's like, I noticed that a lot in the 80s. The whole reason for having the band was to be huge and be like a Bon Jovi and be on the cover of magazines and, bang chicks in hot tubs and stuff. That's what it became. But all the great bands, the ones that really matter, to me, that was never part of their thing. It was about what they were doing and the scene and the music and the, and all the sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Like I said, those days, 60s, 70s, and 80s, that was sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But it's a time that's passed. But it just struck me today. I was listening to some music. I was like, The Clash, Train in Vain was a big song, 1979, all over the radio. But the Clash never, embraced all that. They just did their thing, and they left behind some of the most incredible music in the history of rock and roll. Clash, the only band that mattered. That was somebody gave them that slogan. But anyway, that's my little take on that. I don't even know what you want to call this subject. But thanks for tuning in. 1985 Road Dogg. Speak to you soon. Hope you're well. Thanks. Bye-bye.